What do the world's most successful and productive people all have in common? They learn something new every day. This is why I do this podcast. And it's why I love Brilliant.org, the sponsor of this episode. It's the online platform that presents short courses crafted by award-winning teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. So do me a favor right now, go to brilliant.org/skeptic. You know how it's spelled, BRILLIANT.org/skeptic, and you get a 30-day free trial. And the first 200 of you to log in and do this will get 20% off your annual subscription. What does the subscription get you? Unbelievable amount of online content. Just an app right on your phone. I access it all the time. Just tap on it and a bunch of courses pop up. Courses I've already started, courses that I haven't checked out yet, like just the one here's one called Scientific Thinking, which I've been working through, and they have different kinds of puzzles, online problems to solve. Each of them just takes a few minutes, and it gives you instant feedback, whether you're right or wrong, and trying to answer the question. So it's an interactive effect. And I do this not only for this one category, scientific thinking, of which there's dozens of different tutorials I could do, but also classical mechanics, electricity and magnetism, quantum computing, the chemical reaction, computational biology, statistics and finance, probabilities and statistics, random variables and distributions, casino probabilities. That's a good one to have. And so this is why I love Brilliant and why I think you will too. So check it out. Go to brilliant.org/skeptic or click on the link below in the description. And you get a 30-day free trial. And the first 200 of you to do this, you get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. So thank you to Brilliant for supporting the show. And thank you for listening. And check out brilliant.org/skeptic and then listen to our episode. All right, here we go. All right, everyone. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. I am your host, Michael Shermer. Again, remember, publisher of Skeptic magazine, which you can pick up at any fine bookstore, or at skeptic.com/magazine. You can subscribe. We're in print and digital, of course, as always. And if you support the podcast and our work promoting science and critical thinking, you can make a donation at skeptic.com/donate. The Skeptic Society is a 501c3 nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible. Okay, my guest today is Bethany Mandel. She is a contributing writer for Deseret News, an editor of the children's book series Heroes of Liberty, a columnist for Fox News, and a homeschooling mother of 6. You're making up for me. I only have 2. She is a frequent guest and host on talk radio and occasionally appears on Fox News, OANN, and Newsmax. She has written for the New York Times, the New York Post, Washington Post, Washington Examiner, Newsweek, Spectator, and more. Bethany lives with her husband, Seth, and their children in Silver Spring, Maryland. Her new book, co-authored with Carol Markovitz, is Stolen Youth: How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. Let me just make a few comments about this. The day we're recording this podcast on May 23rd, we released a podcast episode that I did with Inga Thompson, one of the most decorated cyclists in American history, who's been experiencing major blowback for defending women's rights in sports, most notably women's rights to compete against biological women and not biological men, however they identify, and women's only spaces like locker rooms, bathrooms, etc. But let me be clear, this is a sensitive and complex issue, I know. And so this is the statement we included with that podcast. Transgender individuals often experience body dysmorphia. Common treatments for dysmorphia include hormone therapy and gender affirmation surgery, which typically entails surgically creating a neo-vagina, breast implants, facial feminization, and sometimes hair transplants or alteration of the vocal cords. These physical changes often help alleviate the symptoms, but they do not fundamentally change the physical advantages the transgender, that is, born biological male athlete, has over biological women when competing in women's sports. So this is one of these conflicting rights issues, as many are in society. And today's conversation with Bethany Mandel is also touching on some of these conflicting rights issues, the rights of parents versus children, schools versus privacy, and so forth. So we're going to get into all that, which is what her book deals with. Bethany, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for your work on this important topic. First, give us a little bit of background. What led you to write this book? What alerted you to that there was a problem that needed to be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really emerged over the course of COVID, and that's why we addressed COVID much more than I think logic would sort of indicate to you that it would be a large portion of a book that's more about sort of a political movement. But for us, we sort of saw that COVID was when the forest fire became out of control, when it came to radical ideology seeping into our children's lives and dictating dictating their trajectory. This ideology was always latent, but when COVID hit, there was a large sector of sort of people in power, whether they be in schools or in the American Academy of Pediatrics, or sort of more generally in medical associations, that sort of took the opportunity to not let an opportunity go to waste. And so there was a great acceleration of this politicization of childhood over the course of COVID, and I think that we're seeing now in a post-COVID era that they're not letting the reins go. And so over the course of COVID, Carol and I were extremely vocal about the importance of normalcy returning for children, including school closures, so the end of school closures. And so we realized like this was part of a larger ideology that was coming for our children. And it was all intertwined with phenomenons like Drag Queen Story Hour, which just a couple years ago was still considered to be fringe. And now it's pretty mainstream. It's happening across the country in libraries and bars, even in local gardens. That's happening where I live in Montgomery County. And so we sort of saw all of this as part of a larger political movement aimed at our children.
Okay, just this morning I was driving to the office, and there was a news story on Associated Press of a burger joint in Florida suing Ron DeSantis because they hold drag queen, not story hour, just drag queen events or entertainment.
There's no more books
or whatever
anymore. Now it's just drag queens twerking for children.
Yeah, but this is not that case. This is not a school or library. This is just a burger joint. And parents don't have to go there. There's no expectation that children should be there. It's just open. Anybody could come. So he feels like my business is being cut into now. This is one of these conflicting issues, right? Between privacy and government intervention into the marketplace. Why shouldn't the burger guy be free to do whatever he wants? Have his drag queen, and you can go or not. Or maybe you go and you leave your kids behind, or you don't, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we have these guardrails in place in other areas of America. You can't bring a child under the age of 18 into a lot of places that serve alcohol already, not just bars, but anywhere that serves alcohol. There's also laws about, bringing a child into a strip club. And so, I mean, I think this is the most analogous example, because this is a sexual performance. It just happens to be from someone in drag, but it's still a sexualized performance. So I don't think that is an appropriate venue for a child to be present.
So maybe a correction or a fine tuning of the law would be children not allowed, but the burger place can have all the drag queen performances they want.
Yeah, okay. Do it.
Right. Yeah, right. Okay, so here's the question. How big a problem is this? Your book is filled with anecdotes, and you hear them all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just talking with my wife about this. Oh, come on, this drag queen thing. How big is this really? And 5 minutes later, she comes back with one of her best friends' email saying, "Oh my God, they're doing drag queen tomorrow at my kid's school." It's a Waldorf school, so it's a private school.
Yeah.
But Waldorf tends to be pretty liberal, I guess.
Yeah, it does.
But so here's my question. Okay, so you have a lot of stuff about craziness in libraries, in schools. Well, so I looked up, there's something like 90,000 public libraries in the United States. There's something like 90,000 schools in the United States of all sizes and so on. So what's the base rate? I mean, lots of anecdotes, they're real, and they're disturbing. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
But is it 1%? Is it 10%? Do we even have any idea? Has anyone collected data?
No, it's hard to collect data. I mean, I think that the best data and And I believe that I used it in the book. The best data that we have, honestly, is the voting trends of. I mean, I think librarians is an easier one to put sort of a pulse on, because it's sort of run by a librarian. And in a school, you have lots of different teachers, and so even within one school district and one school, between second grade, if you have two different second grade teachers, that experience is going to be different from a classroom to classroom basis. But in a library, it's a lot easier to get a pulse on that. And so libraries are one of the easiest ways for political ideology to manifest through who runs it, because you can just look on the shelves and you can see the purchasing that they're doing. They have a lot of control over the purchasing, depending on the bylaws of the library. But generally speaking, librarians have a lot of leeway into what they purchase. But you can see where their ideology falls according to how they donate politically. And I'm trying to find the number in the book, and I'm having a hard time talking and looking at the same time. But it's in the 90s.
Go ahead and look. And
okay.
While you're doing that, I did a post on Twitter the other day, a Vox poll, or vox.com site of data of employees voting in the 2022 midterms in tech, and Google, Apple, Netflix, Intel, Microsoft, all the way down. There's like 50 companies, and the ratio was like 99-1 Democrat to Republican, on down to maybe 70-30. So it was overwhelming liberal for tech companies. And interestingly, then, on the other side, in kind of old industry, tends to lean right. So it's an interesting cut. It's not just the economy. It's different sectors, rural versus urban, for example. The rural tends to go Republican, urban tends to go Democrat. So you see those kind of cuts anyway. So I guess your point is that by tracking some of that data through libraries, you can see those effects.
So according to sort of how they vote, or I'm sorry, how they donate, you can see when you donate, you have to give your profession, and so that data is tracked. I can't find the number, but it's in the 90s. About over 90% of librarians are donating to far left causes, whether they be super PACs or actual candidates. But you can just look at who was just elected the president of the American Library Association. The American Library Association just elected a woman who ran on a platform of being a Marxist lesbian. That was her platform. Like, this is what I'm going to bring to the table as my perspective as a Marxist lesbian. And she was elected by the membership of the American Library Association. And they want that. The librarians of America voted that that's who they want heading their organization, because she represents their views.
Right. What percentage of Americans in, say, Gallup and Pew polls support what you would describe as the far left, woke, progressive ideology that you're talking about?
So it's probably in the eighth percentile. The last data that I saw was under 10%. So I would say about 8%. But the problem is, and this is something that we go into a great deal in our book, is that 8% have a great deal of power from the top of organizations. But a lot of what this is fear. And so people who run HR departments, for example, at a hospital system, just hypothetically, they will follow the guidelines placed before them by different HR companies, and very fearful of litigation. And so they really bend over backwards to make sure that they are diverse and equitable and accepting and all of these things, so that they don't get smacked with a lawsuit. And so in a hospital system, they are obligated to follow a lot of these DEI requirements. And the result is, at your kid's pediatrician, I mean, we're speaking about kids, at your kid's pediatrician, the pediatrician's group is run by a hospital. It's there's very few operating pediatricians' offices that are independent from hospital systems. And so hospital systems are setting policy for a lot of healthcare providers that we see on a one-to-one basis. So you don't have to go into a hospital in order to be impacted by hospital policy. And so the result is they have to follow the guidelines of the hospital system that are extremely grounded in this framework of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's the basis of all of this phenomenon is that.
Yeah. All right, let's put this into perspective. So 8%. Half the country is Democrat, half the country is Republican, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
So even if all 8% are 100% of the 8% are Democrats, that still means the vast majority of Democrats are against or do not support far left woke progressive ideology.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're kind of seeing that. I mean, it's really interesting watching this bifurcation on the left of people who are, I think there's three camps. I think there's people who are all in. I think there's people who are wishy-washy, like, I just think, why don't we all just try to get along? Everything, who cares what they call themselves? I'll use your pronouns, whatever. I'll just be accepting and open, whatever, because I want to be nice. And then there's a third camp, and I would say that third camp is like the J.K. Rowling camp. And that camp is, similar to the cyclist that you just discussed, who says, like, you cannot negotiate with this ideology because the basis of this ideology is an erasure of women. It's an erasure of gender norms that are incredibly important for women's safety, women's progress. And so the J.K. Rowlings of the world see this phenomenon as not just eliminating the gains of women in sports and, the possible futures of women in sports, but also women's safety in prisons, domestic violence shelters, locker rooms, bathrooms, but also just the erasure of us as a people. And so, I think the very first time that J.K. Rowling waded into this issue was when a tweet went out about menstruating people. And she was like, what did we used to call those? What were those?
If only we had a word for that.
Right. We used to call them women. And it's just the total erasure of women from public life. And for me, it's frustrating because it feels like we're stepping backwards in our progress as a society. And so, there are people, there was a woman yesterday in Trader Joe's who, my 3-year-old was dressed in boy clothes because she has 2 older brothers and I'm very lazy. And she was like, oh, is she? And I was like, no, she can wear a Paw Patrol shirt and blue shorts and still be a girl because she's 3.
Paw Patrol.
But now, if you don't conform to these very rigid gender norms, all of a sudden you're in the wrong body. And this is somehow something that needs to be cured and alleviated through surgery or hormones. And those cures, quote unquote, don't necessarily improve outcomes. We're fed that lie, but it's not being fleshed out by the data, and it's why in Europe they're rolling back a lot of these policies because they're realizing, like, we're investing a lot of money and a lot of time into these surgical solutions, these hormonal solutions. We're creating new problems where they once didn't exist physically. The creation of a neo-vagina is potentially incredibly dangerous, and it opens a point for infection. And, when you fiddle with something, things can break. And so we're doing all of these things, but we're not seeing the mental health results that would indicate that the risk is worth it.
In other words, that wasn't the original problem. The problem was something else, and maybe that was a proxy for it.
Yes, yeah, and you can see that also in the data when you look at people who manifest gender dysphoria. They have a host of comorbidities. I think the most common is probably autism. About 1/3 of people who who say that they have gender dysmorphia actually are on the autism spectrum. But there's, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder. There's a lot of other comorbidities that can explain the gender dysmorphia. And when you hyper focus on the gender dysmorphia, you're not necessarily treating what is potentially, and I would argue probably, the underlying problems, which are the bipolar, the anxiety, the depression.
Yeah. So that would be your explanation for the spike in the last 4 or 5 years amongst that cohort of, say, 13 to 19-year-old, mostly girls.
I would say that it's a social contagion. I mean, we've seen over the course of the last couple generations different mental health epidemics, I would honestly say, among that cohort. And so you would have just a few years ago, cutting, anorexia or bulimia. There was a really hyper-focused amount of time where we were seeing tics. Those were sort of traced back to TikTok, actually. But
Really?
you were seeing sort of, oh gosh, what's the word? Physical tics.
Sure. Yeah.
And you were...
it's part of the autism spectrum.
Yes, that's true, but it's something else.
Asperger's, I was thinking.
No,
not that.
They're physical twitches. I'm like, the word is escaping me at the moment. But that was actually traced back to social media. And so this is that age is an incredibly fraught time. And it's when a lot of mental health challenges emerge. And so I think this is the latest sort of emergent, and it's coming via social media. It's coming through TikTok and YouTube. Those are the two sort of traces. That's wild.
It's a little bit like the Salem witch trials, where the girls started twitching and writhing on the floor and then copying each other.
Yes.
That was a total social contagion.
Yeah. It's interesting. The podcast that was just released with J.K. Rowling was called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. Yeah. And one of the episodes talked about the Salem witch trials, and the host, Megan Phelps Roper, who escaped a cult, so she has this background in that, she talked to a historian who has expertise in the Salem witch trials and drew parallels between this moment and the Salem witch trials, and there are parallels.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Let's talk about the mechanism of how a small percentage of people can drive a movement like that. So here I think of pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else believes something when in fact they don't. The classic example is binge drinking on college campuses. Individually, college students will say, no, I don't like binge drinking, but everybody else does, so I kind of got to go along with it. And then, all of a sudden you have binge drinking, right? So, and that can hold aloft a belief system for quite some time. Mm-hmm. The majority of Germans were not exterminationist anti-Semitic. They were anti-Semitic, but everybody was in Europe, in the 1930s. So, but but by the time it got so extreme where they were, euthanizing people and then murdering Jews and so on, it's too late. You can't speak up because, there was no free press, and they locked people up. It's more extreme version of cancel culture. But so, in other words, if you see everyone around you saying something, and then a few people get canceled on college campuses or in a library system or whatever, it's better to keep your mouth shut and your head down, even though most people don't go along with it. That's the kind of social pressure that can drive a movement like that, even if the majority don't go along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the classic children, because I homeschool and work in children's literature, the classic example is The Emperor's New Clothes. And so we read that book a lot over the course of COVID. And that COVID moment, sort of rewinding back to the beginning of our conversation of like, how did we get to this book from looking through the lens of COVID? That was exactly how we saw that fear permeating in the COVID era about what we were doing to sort of avoid COVID, like all these different avoidance measures vis-a-vis COVID. And so, there was a lot of this happening in the medical field. And so if you talked to pediatricians or just regular doctors one-on-one, like, do you really think the cloth masks are doing anything? And they would be like, oh, I don't really know. But broadly, that was the message being sent from the top down, from Fauci on down, from the CDC on down, that this t-shirt on your face will magically prevent us from spreading and catching an airborne virus. And I compare it to mosquitoes flying through a chain link fence. You put your chain link fence up in order to protect your backyard from mosquitoes, and lo and behold, it's not working, and they're going through and they're going over. It's not working. That's the idea with the cloth masks. They never worked. It never made sense. And in the beginning of the pandemic, Fauci said as much, but then they sort of felt like they had to say something to make people feel like they could do something. And so they really, really focused on the masks. The masks will save us. And we see the data now in areas where there were mask mandates and where there weren't, and there was no change. And sometimes even actually the places where there were mask mandates, COVID was a tiny, tiny bit worse. There was more spread, there was more severe outcomes, and I would posit that the masks gave people a false sense of assurance. And so you could stand closer together in longer time periods because, everyone's wearing a mask. But if you're wearing a cloth mask, or if you're wearing just a surgical mask, that's not doing anything. And so I think that this hyperfixation on masks actually made things worse. But yeah, I mean, over the course of COVID, I think that they saw how they could ram through these messages. Believe the science, trust in the mask up to protect each other, like all of these mantras, and they saw how it worked. It sort of quieted people. I mean, COVID was sort of terrifying because you also had big tech sort of swooping in, and if you ever said anything, even verbally on Instagram stories about a vaccine or a shot, even just like, I'm going to take a shot, like basketball, take a shot. The big tech
right,
picked up that you use the word shot and would put a vaccine misinformation warning on the bottom of your Instagram story. The extent to which there was buy-in from big tech to the media. I mean, I tried to write things about masks and about the vaccines and everything, and I'm a writer. And I would hear pushback from editors, like, we've been told by our superiors we're not allowed to publish anything like that. And so where do you go? You can't say it on social media. You can't post it on Facebook. You can't read it in a newspaper because they're being told by their superiors that you can't go there. And so there was a lot. You go on Joe Rogan. Yeah, and that's what happened.
There is alternative media, fortunately.
Yeah. I mean, but Joe Rogan, because he's Joe Rogan, was safe, but he was faced by a massive backlash on the part of Spotify, Spotify employees. And if he were not Joe Rogan, they would have just canceled him. They would have just taken him off Spotify.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's looking like closing the schools was also a bad idea. Now language development is way behind, math and English and everything is behind. So, the problem is we just didn't know. So I call this a signal detection problem.
I disagree with you. I think we did know.
You do?
Yes.
I don't think so. I think say spring of 2020, it's starting to spread. What if it's going to be like Ebola and it's going to kill 20 million Americans?
We had the data out of China and Italy. We knew who it was impacting, and it wasn't children, and it wasn't even their parents. The problem with a lot of this was we're pleading ignorance for the past. We had no way of knowing that school closures were bad. Of course we had not pre-knowledge that school closures are bad. If you look at the sort of test scores out of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, when they only closed schools for 2 months, they were catastrophically bad. And it took them years to catch up after 2 months. And so what would have been a healthier thing to do is to, in that moment, say, this is an emergency measure that we are taking that will have detrimental consequences. And we have to do this in a very careful way. And we have to consistently reassess. I'm talking on a week-to-week basis. We have to sit down and say, what is the spread? Can we have classes outside? Like, what can we do to think outside the box? Because closing schools is bad. And they never came at it from that perspective. They gaslit us the whole time and said, well, we have no way of knowing if Zoom school is insufficient or not. And like any parent who was sitting and watching Zoom school was ripping their hair out saying, of course we know that Zoom school is bad. And the American Academy of Pediatrics did it too. They put out a statement and said, we have no studies that indicate that masks are detrimental to language or emotional acquisition, whether it be masks on children or masks on caregivers. But they took a pamphlet off their website simultaneous to that announcement saying the importance of FaceTime for infants cannot be understated. Infants need to see faces in order to understand emotions. And they took that informational pamphlet off of their website at the same time that they're claiming that there is no evidence that masks are detrimental to children. It's because you didn't study it, and you don't want to study it because you don't want to know the answer. They wanted to push forward the masks and gaslight us about any side effects, any consequences of it. And now, fast forward to 2023, oh, golly gee, there were consequences. How could we possibly have known this? If you thought about it for 30 seconds and were brave enough to say it out loud, that's how you could have realized it.
Right. Well, the way you're phrasing this is that, gaslighting, they intentionally did this. Why? What is your interpretation of their motivation?
So for the American Academy of Pediatrics, they took that information off their website, which anyone who's ever raised an infant knows. When you smile in their faces and make big, exaggerated gestures, they react to that. And when you cover your mouth and then try that, it's a different experience. And they took that information off their website about the importance of making these exaggerated facial expressions to children and talking to children and smiling at children, especially 1 and under. That's a critical moment of development. And they took that information off their website at the same time as they started saying there is no evidence that masks can impact development, whether it be emotional or language. And why did they do that? I mean, it's the basis of the book. It's because the top tier of the American Academy of Pediatrics has been captured by this ideology. And in order to have membership within those ranks at that moment, you had to buy into the fallacy of the masks 100%. You could not deviate from that message that masks are critically important to preventing the spread of COVID. And it was just not true.
Okay, but what is their motivation? Why do that? And now we're not wearing masks anymore. So what happened?
Yeah, why? I mean, there's only so long that you can have this lie. And now, fast forward to 2023, they're finally studying the effectiveness of masks, and they're finally doing comparison studies of the spread of COVID in places where there was no mask mandate and where there was one. And we see it didn't really do anything. And so there's this sort of quiet forgetting and this quiet backing up of my pediatrician just recently dropped masks within the last couple weeks. And their statement about why we're doing it now makes no sense. Well, the numbers are down and the impact of COVID is lessening over time. What's different about now? What's different? What magically changed within the last few weeks? And they don't have an answer. There is no answer. Yeah. They've just decided everyone's just kind of done with it. That's it.
But the way you say it implies there's something like a cabal going on behind closed doors. Okay, let's see how many people we can get to wear masks so we can then take it to another level to control their freedoms and take away their autonomy because we want power. I mean, it kind of sounds like that. I have a hard time imagining people doing that.
This is coming from. This is coming from the top with the head of the CDC, Walensky, and the head of the NIH, Anthony Fauci. They sort of changed the messaging. And then when you try to sign your kid up for summer camp and they require masks, they throw their hands in the air and they're like bureaucrats. And they say, well, we're just following CDC guidelines. We're just following CDC guidelines. And So you look at, what is the CDC saying? What is the NIH saying? That is from the top down. And it's also coming from the American Academy of Pediatrics from the top down.
Right. Okay. So I guess, those studies that have now been debunked because they didn't survive the replication crisis about unconscious bias and unconscious racism,
Right.
through the implicit association test. Okay. In a way, it feels like you're kind of saying these people subconsciously want to control us, and therefore they're purposely ignoring information they had for what motive or whatever. How do you know that's what they are thinking? Maybe they're just made a mistake. Maybe they just screwed up.
No. I mean, Anthony Fauci in March of 2020 said logical stuff on masks, that it's an airborne virus and masks don't really do anything. We have his emails from that time period in which he was sounding the right notes on masks. And on the CDC, there are senators and congresspeople who have tried to get answers from Walensky and said, let's talk about masks from ages 6 and under. So the WHO, the World Health Association, who set sort of guidelines, and not policy, but guidelines in the same way the CDC does. The WHO does it everywhere else in the world. The WHO said under no circumstances should you mask any child under 6. And between ages 6 and 12, you really have to be very conscientious of the checks and the balance, like the pluses and the minuses of masking that age cohort. And you really have to make sure that you're doing it only when absolutely necessary. And so these were the guidelines that the WHO set, and they were always the guidelines. So what happened, and this is a question that was asked in a letter from congressmen and senators to the CDC, what happens when you cross the American border? Why are our policies so drastically different? Why in America did we tell people that a 25-month-old has to wear a mask 8 hours a day at daycare, but that would never be the policy anywhere else in the world because they follow the WHO? So where are you getting that differentiation in policy? And they wouldn't answer that email. They sidestepped that letter and said, we were just working with, this is the same BS like line. Like we didn't know, we were working with the best information we had at the time. No, but answer the question. Why was the CDC suggesting different guidelines than the WHO? Why? Why did we differ? And I think that the answer is that someone in the American bureaucracy in the early part of the pandemic said, you can wear a mask over the age of 2. And then that can became a should. And that should became a must. And it's hard to roll anything back, especially when you are speaking from such a place of assurance and trust and science. And so how many times have we heard from anyone in the CDC or the NIH, like, we made a mistake. And honestly, not just a mistake, but a mistake that we should not have made. This was a mistake that was an unforced error. Mm-hmm. We've never heard that about anything they said over the course of the pandemic. They said, like, oh, we did the best that we could with the information we had at the time. But the information that we had at the time was that over in Europe, they were doing things very differently. They opened the schools earlier than we did. They took the masks off earlier than we did, and they never masked anyone under the age of 6. Why are the outcomes worse here than they were there? No answers.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess we probably just need to find out more. I remember being in the local Blaze Pizza during all that when you had to have a mask on when you came in, but the people sitting right next to me in the line were unmasked eating. And so the guy, I took my mask off, and the manager's like, sir, and the person unmasked is like right between me and the guy. So I said, how does the virus know to skip over the eater and get into my nostril? He's like, sir, I'm sorry. This is the rules I have to enforce.
And that was it. I mean, this is, I never make Holocaust comparisons, but this is how you can realize how that happened. Because people just did things without questioning and without any consideration of, with the masks, for example. What about someone who's on the autism spectrum who has sensory difficulties? What about them? What about people? So the first day after the Smithsonian's dropped the masks, I went with my children because I was like, hallelujah, finally we can go back to the Smithsonian. And I went to the Smithsonian with my children, and there was someone in a wheelchair who had cystic fibrosis, and they weren't wearing a mask. And I thought to myself, this person hasn't been able to be in a Smithsonian in over 2 years, because you can't wear a mask if you have breathing difficulties already. Where was the consideration for that individual in this process? There's never a thought for the people for whom masking wasn't easy, or for whom any number of these things weren't easy. It was just everyone is uniform and everyone can and should and must do this. And if you can't, tough luck. And we're seeing lawsuits, in Virginia, for example, in Northern Virginia, from parents who said, like, you had a legal obligation to educate my child who has special needs, and you left them behind over the course of the pandemic. And the masking is part of that. And they're filing lawsuits and saying, what we did the best we could isn't good enough.
All right, let's pull back and look at a little bit of the bigger picture here. Much of your book talks about the left, the progressive left, the woke progressive left, and various variations on that. We already identified only 8% of Americans accept this. So most Democrats do not go this far. So how do you distinguish, say, the left from just J.K. Rowling type liberals? Just call it that. Or my friend Inga Thompson, the cyclist. I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I don't know what happened to my party. I may have to vote Republican. All right, so
you're
maybe
saying that, or Inga's? But I'm sorry. You're saying
Inga
that, or she's saying that? Yeah. Okay.
She said that. Yeah, she said that. And but I hear a lot of people like Carol Tavris, the great social psychologist, a good friend. She's just apoplectic about this. What happened? I'm a liberal. What happened? Yeah. Liberals, why aren't you speaking up about it? Yeah. Okay, so how do you distinguish, say, the left from just regular liberals who don't go that far versus, say, conservatives and so on?
I mean, if you're like faced with two people who have like a blue thing and they're standing in the voting booth, to me, you ask them, what is a woman? Okay. One of them can answer and one of them doesn't really want to, because it's like, however someone feels. And the Ingas and the JKs of the world will say, like, a person who is born with a vagina, who has a uterus and ovaries and is biologically a woman. It's actually very easy to distinguish between a man and a woman. And I think that's most of America. Most of America, if you put you and I in front of them, and you're wearing a wig and I'm wearing pants and a t-shirt, and they say, which one of them is a woman, they'll still be able to identify me as a woman, even if you're wearing a dress.
When I'm out riding my bike, I can tell when I see a cyclist up the road, maybe a quarter mile away, whether it's a man or a woman.
Yeah, we have very different faith. Yeah.
Hips.
I mean, if you just look
the
at
hips.
I was just about to say the hips. I was like making that motion with the hips. I mean, if you look at a skeleton from 100 years ago, you don't have to ask that skeleton what their gender ideology is. You can just look at their bone structure, their hips in particular. Yeah,
do you know Elizabeth Weiss, the archaeologist at San Jose State?
This sounds familiar.
Yeah, she's getting major blowback from her university for identifying skeletons by their sex. Which
was there a debate between her and someone else, and she stood up and was like, I remember that.
Yeah. So she's gotten a lot of blowback from the university. They locked her out of her fossil collection because she refused to, go along with this idea. Like, we can't really say what sex or gender the skeleton is because we don't know how they identified. It's like, no, this is crazy.
No, I just got a pamphlet from the Kennedy Center. They're doing a show called 1776, and the show is about highlighting the important contributions at the time of the American Revolution of people who were non-binary or transgender. Okay. And that's just a total figment of their imaginations. Didn't exist.
Okay, so who are these people pushing this? I mean, the head of the library or the library association or a teacher or principal at school, just pick some mid-level manager that's going for the pronouns. We got to have diversity, equity, and inclusion at our university or whatever. I don't picture them reading Lenin and Marx and Stalin and Trotsky and Saul Alinsky's How to Be a Revolution and
I agree.
orchestrate this whole thing, how are they inculcating this into their thinking? And might we see them as, well, they're well-intentioned. It's like the next rights revolution. We had, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, workers' rights, children's rights. Now we have LGBTQT rights,
right,
or something like that.
So
to them, maybe they just feel like I'm just doing the next thing.
yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because I think a lot of this is, that the way to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think that there's a lot of good intentions here. And when I talk to, friends and family who are more left-leaning, but in that sort of middle ground area that I talked about earlier, they're kind of like, well, nobody's hurting. No one's being hurt and no one's hurting anyone. So why not just go along with the pronouns? And, why I don't go along with the pronouns is because I think that you are harming that person by affirming this false ideology that could then lead them to taking irreversible, very damaging steps in the form of hormones, puberty blockers, or physical surgery, mastectomy, the creation of a neo-vagina if it's a man. All of that affirmation is, and you hear these stories from people who have detransitioned. That affirmation sort of builds on each other, and it makes people feel like they have this emotional buoy. And they're already feeling very weighted down by the weight of their other mental health comorbidities. And so this is buoying them. And they're also, especially for children, they're feeling like the farther they go and the more they do it, they can't walk it back without this being like thing. You can't just take it back. There's no take backsies when it comes to this stuff. Because then all the affirmation is gone and it's replaced sometimes by contempt. It's sometimes people who are angry with them. And you see that in the transgender community, the vitriol that they have towards detransitioners is really, really drastic. And so I think that there's a lot of good intentions, but they are aligning the way to hell with those good intentions. There's a lot of people who, and I spoke to a lot of individuals about this sort of on an anecdotal basis. People would put their pronouns in their signature, in their email signature, or on their Zoom. And then people felt like in order to be inclusive and to be understanding and to be open and welcoming, they had to do the same. And so it became, again, like an emperor's new clothes thing where everyone is doing it and they're not really sure why.
Mm-hmm. I don't use pronouns in my signature line, but everybody, because I'm in the publishing world and in academia, every email I get has almost everyone, except for maybe people my age, late boomers. I don't know. Why don't I do it? I guess for the same reason you do. Why even go down that pathway? It's a vanishingly small percent, 0.1% of people who are really gender dysphoria like that. And, they should not be discriminated against. They have the same rights as everybody else and so on. But this seems different. And also seems different from the gay rights movement.
Yeah.
Andrew Sullivan's been making this point, that these young teenage, like he said, if I was a 13-year-old now and was attracted to boys, I'd be told you're not, you're straight. Yes. Yeah. You're just in the wrong body. And so.
Yeah. And that's something that's very troubling to me as well. And a real, I say this as an outsider, so it's potentially and maybe probably inappropriate for me to say, but I'm disappointed in the gay rights sort of community and movement as I am also disappointed in feminists as well. I feel like this ideology really cuts to the core of their original mission statement, which was building a more accepting and welcoming world for especially teens and young adults who are gay or lesbian. And this world is less accepting of effeminate gay males or masculine lesbian females because they are now being told that their feelings regarding their sexuality and their identity is because that they were born in the wrong body. And I think about my friends who are gay and lesbian who have children and who had those children, through assisted reproduction of some kind because they're not having heterosexual relationships, but they have biological children. And had this ideology existed when they were young and they had gone down these paths, they would have been rendered infertile and their children wouldn't exist. And their lives as they stand now, which are wonderful lives, rich, with partners, with children, they wouldn't exist now, because they would have been sold this lie that rendered them not only infertile, but also medicalized them for life. Once you start down this road of hormones or surgery, these are now medical issues that need to be addressed and monitored for the rest of someone's life. And I think we're going to see their lives are being shortened as a result of all of these interventions.
There are gay people like Andrew Sullivan, I mentioned, pushing back against that, calling it a form of homophobia.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Of course, the J.K. Rowlings of the world, liberals speaking out. But I guess they're pushing back against a pretty mighty tide here, post Me Too movement, post George Floyd, BLM, and all that. I guess that there's a fear of speaking out and being accused of being on the wrong side of history. You're a transphobe and so on. No one likes to be called that. So how should you respond? I mean, what's the right approach? Just to deny it, or just say, I'm not a transphobe and here's why, and then make that distinction between, say, those categories, who you're attracted to versus who you identify as. They're not the same kind of moral rights revolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult. I mean, if you think about J.K. Rowling, I think J.K. Rowling is in a different category than Andrew Sullivan. Yes. But she can say whatever she wants. And she kind of makes jokes about it sometimes on Twitter, which I love. And she says, like, someone will tweet her and say, I'm burning my copy of Harry Potter. And she's like, I will continue to sit on my giant pile of money and mourn the loss of your $13 that you have already spent. And so she has the luxury of being outspoken in a way that Andrew Sullivan doesn't really. Andrew Sullivan took a risk and he went independent. And there's a lot of these sort of neoliberal thinkers that went independent. Iglesias, Barry Weiss is another one. Barry Weiss left the New York Times and then she married her female colleague and they had a baby together. Like, she's not conservative, but now she's falling in those camps because the left has become what it is. But how does an individual push back against this? It's difficult, and it takes a lot of courage. When we were writing our book, we heard from an editor that said, we want you to take the fight message out. And we said, there is no pushing back against this without a fight. And sometimes people have to be uncomfortable, and myself included and Carol included. Like, sometimes you have to make an uncomfortable decision. One of my friends, over the course of COVID, his kid was on Zoom, and their, I think, third grade teacher had her pronouns in her Zoom name on the bottom. And he contacted her and said, I would like you to remove that. And that's quite a request of a parent to a third grade teacher. And she said, understandably, what is it your business what I put in my Zoom? And he was like, well, you're interfacing with my child and that's my business. And in our family, we are not comfortable with the idea that your gender is able to be changed. It's not malleable. That's what I was looking for. Permeable, malleable, whatever. It's not malleable. And we are not comfortable with you introducing that ideology to our child in a way that is facing them all day long on Zoom. She knows you're a girl. Every kid in the class knows you're a girl. You don't need to put your pronouns. And he brought it to the principal. He brought it to this, and he lost. Wow. But he made that argument, and it got people thinking, and it got people talking. And everyone else was sort of like, that's kind of strange how she does that. And he was like, I'm not okay with it. And he became that parent. And sometimes you have to be okay with becoming that parent or that person or that patient, because truth is truth.
Yeah, you mentioned Barry Weiss. This has all become so politicized. She was my editor at the Wall Street Journal when I was reviewing for them. She's right out of college, so I've known her a long time. I never thought of her as conservative or liberal. I couldn't quite tell what she was, which is good.
That's the mark of a good editor.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so she has the free press. She left the New York Times and so on. It seems like, though, she's moving toward the right, as it does with Jordan Peterson, for example. But I'm not sure they're really conservative why is it that so many of my people, I'm not conservative, seem to be moving to the right, because you guys are the ones that are taking a stand here and the liberals aren't? It's something like that?
I think it's part. I mean, I think you're right. Like Jordan Peterson is on the Daily Wire. Like I think that you can confidently say he's moving rightward. I don't know if I would say that about Barry. I think that the difference, and this is my own personal biases as a conservative, I think that the difference is there is room for disagreement on the right that there isn't on the left. And so if you think about like Dave Rubin, who's another one of these people who moved from left literally to right. He's like a DeSantis booster. He, as a gay man, feels much more comfortable saying controversial things in the sphere of his new right-wing bubble than he did in his left-wing bubble. There was a conformity of thought that was required on the left that isn't required on the right. And, you know, some things he says, like, you know, he used surrogates in order to bring his 2 children into this world. That is a very controversial thing on the right. But he's still on the right and he's still welcome. And
why is that controversial on the right?
Surrogacy?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the sort of commodization of women and wombs.
But it's free market.
Not really. I mean, if you look at who is agreeing to become a surrogate, it's women who are desperate and they're sort of pushed into this. And surrogacy agreements are sometimes really cruel. Actually, speaking of Barry Weiss, her sister Susie wrote an incredible piece about surrogacy for the Free Press. There's a lot of clauses within surrogacy contracts that are deeply discomforting. One of them is that the biological parents can require a surrogate to abort at any point in a pregnancy, and so that's taking away that woman's physical agency, which I think that liberals actually are more uncomfortable with, and also. I mean, this is sort of me as a more conservative person talking. The importance of a mother is like men and women are not interchangeable, and the importance of a mother cannot be understated. And I love and respect and admire my gay friends who have adopted because they save children from really dire situations. But I am uncomfortable with bringing children into a scenario in which there is not a maternal influence there. And sometimes life happens and life is not perfect, but the ideal is to have a mother because, I mean, we're mammals, and how does a child survive without a mother? It takes a lot of artificial things. You have to use formula. The biological sort of benefits of having a mother are pretty clear when you look at hormonal spikes and brain scans, you name it. Children are comforted by their mothers. It's why my husband is the favorite parent in this house. But that starts at about a year old. When the babies still need me, I'm the favorite. And then when they are like grow up to know like, oh, he's actually much nicer and much more fun, he becomes the favorite parent. But that first year is incredibly important to have a mother.
Okay, I get that argument, but so if we just talk about on average, it's better to have a mother than not. As I hope you would agree, it's better to have a father than not.
Absolutely.
In the home on average, although like in the case of my wife, she was raised by a single mom in Germany and she came out just fine.
I mean, I was raised by a single mom. Like I see the difference in childhoods between my children and mine.
Yeah.
My mom was superhuman, but it's not the ideal.
Yeah. And so in the case of like Dave Rubin, since you seem to know him and I know he and his partner quite well, I can't imagine them not having just a warm, wonderful family environment for those kids. So what you're just talking about is, of course, he has money and influence and he's a great guy. Not everybody has those opportunities. This is your point, that if you are just a single person with a kid and next to no employment and, it's just got to be rougher for the kids in that environment. Is that what you mean?
I wouldn't even say it's predicated on money. I mean, I think that having a mother and a father is the ideal. It's the imperative. And if that doesn't happen, it's better to have loving parents who are poor than crappy parents who are rich.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes. Right.
You know? But
yeah,
I mean, my larger point about Rubin was that he can do this controversial thing and remain on the right, whereas he couldn't deviate on COVID, for example, and remain in good standing on the left. Like Andrew Sullivan is not in good standing on the left. Barry Weiss is not in good standing on the left. And it's because they deviated.
I noticed your book is published by Daily Wire, as was Heather McDonald's new book. Mm-hmm. And Abigail Schreier's book is by Regnery, which is a conservative publisher, and so on. There's a bunch of examples like that. Why aren't mainstream publishing it, the big five New York publishing houses, who surely could see that there's some big book sales here? Why don't they go for it? We got the trans book, we got the critical book, we got this, that. We're all over the place. We got it covered.
Yeah. So, I mean, we went to auction with our book with some large publishers, and they balked at the last minute. It was at that moment that the moment that we were selling our book was at the moment that Abigail Schreier was seeing a lot of big tech pushback on her book. Target had taken it off their website. Amazon wasn't letting them run ads for her book, and so there was fear, understandable fear on the part of these bigger publishers of a couple things. One of them was that they would pay us a nice advance. We would go through all of the effort, and then they would literally not be able to sell the book. They would not be able to put it on Amazon or Target. And so there was that fear. There's also the fear of mutiny, like we saw with Spotify and Joe Rogan, where they would buy our book. Yeah, they would buy our book, and then there would be a mutiny of their employees, and they would say, we can't. And that happened with, was it Tom Cotton? It was one senator who had his book deal pulled.
That was one, yeah.
Yeah. And so, examples. I mean, if a senator can have his book deal pulled because of a mutiny within a publishing house, Bethany Mandel and Carol Markowitz don't stand a chance.
But that happened to Jordan Peterson, and the publisher said, "The hell with you, we're going to publish it anyway." And
I mean, Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson, but we're not in the same realm.
Okay.
And we can't get to the Jordan Peterson realm because they won't take a chance on us.
Well, why is that? How did Jordan get there? He just stood up and spoke his mind, and
I mean, there was a window. There was an open window in which you could publish conservative content for these big publishers. And now if you look at sort of these big publishers, conservative imprints, they're publishing more of the safe stuff. They're publishing things from senators, publishing things from like Rush Limbaugh's widow, like things that they know will sell gangbusters, but they're not taking a chance on people like Carol and I, who have smaller but very dedicated audiences, and we're talking about issues that a lot of people care about. But we are a gamble, and we were not a gamble they were willing to take, but Daily Wire was. Daily Wire at the end of the day was like, we don't care if we get canceled, because that's Jeremy Boring's sort of like POV, is like, come at me and I'll come at you 10 times harder. Like, you want to push this Hershey crap? I'll sell you better chocolate under the Daily Wire sort of umbrella. You're going to pull this crap with razors. I'm going to sell Jeremy's razors. Screw you. And that like very in your face pushback way of operating is unique to the Daily Wire. And it's what makes them, I think, incredibly powerful and incredibly viable in this marketplace, because you have to have that perspective. It's like this Donald Trump sort of like the best parts and the worst parts. The best and the worst part about Donald Trump was that he just like does not give a crap.
Out what he thinks.
Does not give a crap. And he pushes forward. And like sometimes you want him to care. Sometimes you like, maybe you just roll it back and like listen to your advisors. But, he would do things that were incredibly controversial, like the embassy in Jerusalem. All the experts told him that this would start World War III, and it didn't. And Jared Kushner did a lot of stuff that he was told by all the experts, quote unquote, would lead to catastrophic war, famine, yada, yada, you name it. And like, turned out everything was okay. So sometimes Donald Trump doing controversial things that the experts foretold him not to do went very well, but sometimes it didn't really go so well.
Interesting. All right, I know you got a hard out coming out here. Get to go pick up your kids, and so do I. But since I got you here, pro-life, pro-choice, let's talk about abortion for just 2 minutes.
Oh, God.
If we could do that. Well, okay, so first of all, I trust you're pro-life.
Yeah.
Is there a position of I'm against abortion personally, but I don't feel right about telling women, especially a guy like me,
Right.
what they can and can't do with their bodies. So I'm pro-choice, against abortion personally, pro-choice publicly.
So lucky for us, I actually recorded an entire podcast about this very sticky issue with Barry Weiss.
Oh,
she keeps
okay.
on coming up. So if you Google it was me, Barry, and I don't remember, from Reason. I'm totally blanking on her name.
Yes.
She's the editor-in-chief of Reason.
Yeah.
Good, I'm glad you forget too. I'm terrible. Oh, Catherine Mangu Ward. Oh my God.
Yes, she's great, right?
Yeah,
Thank
she's
you.
wonderful. So the three of us had that conversation, actually.
Yeah.
So my very short, elevator answer is I am pro-life. And I am not comfortable with murder. And I'm also not comfortable with other people committing murder. My judge of the cessation, so our societal judge of the cessation of life is the moment that a heart stops. And in my view, the beginning of life is when a heart starts. I think that that's a very logical start and stop point. And so I think that life begins at the moment a heartbeat begins, and life ends at the moment a heart ends. And I think that there are extenuating circumstances, and this is sort of where I deviate from the pro-life movement, because I'm not Catholic, I'm Jewish. And my view is actually deviates from Jewish law as well. It's like my own personal belief bubble. Catholics believe that life begins at conception. And so they're also much more black and white about areas in which abortion should be legal. I think that those areas they think that area is zero. I think that there's a wider berth within the parameters of Jewish law, that when a fetus endangers the life of its host, of its mother, and cannot exist outside of that, outside of its mother, then that is when it is permissible, and not just permissible, but advisable for that pregnancy to be terminated in order to save the life of the mother. That is the view in Jewish law. There are different interpretations of how that life can endanger its mother. There are psychological sort of openings in Jewish law, like it doesn't have to be life-threatening, like a medical thing, in order to make that allowable. But what's interesting is that even in most states where, since the end of Roe versus Wade, if there is a pregnancy, for example, that's ectopic, there are still allowances within the law, I believe, in almost every state, if not every single state, for that pregnancy to be terminated because it does endanger the life of the mother. So that's like my personal perspective as a complete individual.
I understand. Yeah, that makes sense. It seems to me, here's my position on it, that it's more sentience than heartbeat. That is, when does the brain come online where there's possibility of suffering and some awareness in the womb? Here, we're talking late first trimester, early second trimester. So the intuitions of most Americans polled on this is, abortion should be, legal, safe, and rare. Right. Maybe up to 20 weeks, something like that. And this is where it gets kind of fuzzy. People, bounce around 18 weeks, 20, 22, something like that. Third trimester, absolutely not. That would be wrong. And our intuitions about that kind of follow the science of sentience, brain development.
Right. And what's interesting is that the left, Democrats, have completely abandoned safe, legal, and rare. Like, no longer will they say safe, legal, and rare. Now, if you ask a Democrat what are the limits, they will say legal up until the moment of birth.
Well, that's just crazy. Who says that? Really? I mean, I think the majority don't believe that.
If you ask, if you're interviewing anyone running for office as a Democrat, what are the limits? And that's not a question they're ever asked, by the way. But right. if that question slips through, the answer is up until the moment of birth for almost every single person.
Did they really believe that, or are they just saying it for to appeal to the voters?
I mean, that this is the problem. They're incapable of setting any guardrails, and so they won't.
Yeah. Well, there obviously has to be in this case.
Yeah.
All right, let me channel my inner George Carlin here, because I always do this on the show. And now I can have somebody to say, that's bullshit. That's not what we believe. Where he says, conservatives are pro-life all the way up to the birth of the child. After that, you're on your own. No food stamps, no aid for dependent families. Screw you all the way up until you become military age. And then we're interested in you again. Go ahead and respond to George Carlin's argument.
So, I have a very good friend, Lindsay Fifield. You can find her on Twitter. She is currently fundraising money and spending her week cleaning out the house of a friend of hers who chose life as a single mother. And she is stocking her house with donated items from conservatives. She's used to work at the Heritage Foundation. She used to work for Nikki Haley. Now she's an independent communications contractor. But all of her Twitter followers are conservative. She's very abrasive. Like, you can never follow her unless you're a conservative, because she's a lot. She's really intense. And thousands and thousands of dollars were donated in Amazon wishlist items and monetarily on her Venmo. That is how conservatives answer this question. Pregnancy resource centers are stocked to the gills because people live out their ideals very quietly with their money. They put their money where their mouth is. Our belief is that the government isn't the answer. And so food stamps there's so much waste. There's so much fraud. The government doesn't do things well. A better way to do it is by funding your local food bank. If people are facing hunger, fund the local food bank, volunteer at the local food bank. They are much better equipped and much better stewards of your money than the government is. And so, government isn't the only solution. And, I think that conservatives put their money where their mouth is and their time and their effort where their mouths are.
Okay, fair enough. It's not fair to say conservatives don't care about children. They do, but they think private charity is more effective than government support. Okay. And then, to me, it's not really a problem of abortion. It's a problem of unwanted pregnancies. Why are women getting abortions? Because they don't want to have these babies. Why did they get pregnant in the first place? So then, we kind of back up into that. What is it? Lack of education, lack of access to birth control. Why are they not using birth control? Are they depending on the guy to use birth control? What is going on here?
94% of pregnancies, unintended pregnancies, are terminated because of financial reasons. And it's not a failure of birth control. It's just not going to work out. The fallacy that we don't have access to birth control is absurd. Like, everyone can walk into a store and buy Plan B, buy a condom, IUD is free with insurance, and insurance, speaking of government, like Medicaid, they're very happy to give you a free IUD. Planned Parenthood is happy to give you an IUD, which is like a much more reliable form of birth control than hormonal, pills or whatever, injections. I think that it comes down to people are just not being careful. And you're seeing fewer unintended pregnancies in states that are outlawing abortion because the easy out is no longer easy anymore. And it's still an out. You can go from one state to another, but that requires a lot more effort. And so, there are fewer unintended pregnancies happening.
Yeah. So when your kids are of that age and they're in high school and college and so on, after you tell them, be celibate, but also be realistic, will you tell them use birth control? Just in case.
We will have conversations with them about our value systems, and I hope that, that just in case conversation won't have to happen. But my kids, because I have a baby every other year, especially my older kids, we have very honest conversations with our children about how, this is the biology. This is how babies are made.
Right. Right.
They're very aware.
But Bethany, the flesh is weak, and you're off at college, and you're in the dorm party, and before you know it, you're not prepared, and you have sex. Whoops! This is how it happens. How about preparedness? In case.
That at that point, that's up to them. But we, especially as Jews and as observant Jews, we're not ruled by our flesh and by our impulses and our urges. Like, they are urges that need to be curtailed, and you can't just do whatever you want at every moment because it feels good and because you want to. Sometimes you have to. I mean, we keep kosher, and so after you have a hamburger, you can't have ice cream. I'm sorry. That is
Really?
training. Yeah.
So you're leaning on self-discipline and hoping that is the solution.
Yeah.
I don't
And
know,
a
because you
value
just said
structure.
women are getting pregnant because they're not careful. Well, all right. Yeah, that's a pretty classic conservative position. I understand. All right, I know you got to go in 1 minute. So, Bethany, thank you for coming on the show. Tell us what you're working on next.
I don't know. So, okay, wait, I do have an answer for you.
Okay.
I am launching a Substack with a girlfriend about a conservative perspective on children's literature and homeschool curriculum. It's called Write Books for Kids. Write is RIGHT, and the number 4, writebooksforkids.substack.com. Launching that in the next week.